Well, Jon, thank you for joining me as my first male guest on Red Moon Radio. Appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Caitlin. It's
Yeah,
high time that uh, we had you. I had you on our platform, so it's a pleasure to be with you and yours.
thank you. Yeah, I there were so many things that you said when I joined you that I wanted to ask you questions about. So I was just like, with time constraints, I was like, I should have him on because you have such great insight into the predatory aspect of this movement, and it's really important.
Well, happy to be with you. We can chat about whatever you'd like.
Yeah. So I honestly, I know this is kind of a rush into like intensity, but I really wanted to talk about what you had to say about Ted Bundy and the
Mhm.
element of porn being involved in pretty much every case of I think serial killers and rapists and things like that. So
Right,
I wanted to get your insight on
right.
that.
It's 100%. I can say that definitively, and I have been publicly saying that now for a couple of years, and no one in any position of note has challenged me because they know that I know. Okay, so just because I'm not published at some point in time, I will. Although I have enough out there, I have my own blog, got websites. Um, I can definitively tell people because I did the research through the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, almost like Bessel van der Kolk said, he did his research at his own hospital at his own expense. What that meant was on his own time, he's doing research. Because what better place to do research than if you work in an environment where you then have access to a large pool of those that you're going to be studying. So, for instance, Bessel van der Kolk, when he was looking at trauma, since he heads up the Boston Trauma Center, he doesn't need to go elsewhere to study patients. So he has them right there. So he goes above and beyond. And as he said, he wasn't reimbursed for that. Well, I did the same thing as I was working in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. It's a very unique position being on psychology staff because you have access to the mainframe. In Pennsylvania at the time, there were 27 prisons. I think they're down to 25.
Okay.
The only thing that hasn't changed is there are only two female prisons. So that should let people know, just in terms of sheer numbers, who perpetrates the crimes. And it is very, very rare to have female sex offenders. So we're talking about males. Okay, there are no specialized units for females in a forensic setting. Just because it's so rare, you won't have the staffing ability. It's just, you put your resources where the need is, and there just isn't the need because it's just very rare. And female sex offenders are very different by nature because it's going to have to do with kind of fantasy and relationship. You typically hear the teacher that was teaching high school or junior high boys. That's going to be the
Yeah.
typical. Or she was involved in some sort of trafficking. Okay, so that's going to be for female. But for males, and again, there I was on staff for 11 years in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. With a click of my mouse, even though we had at that time 27 institutions, we tap into the mainframe. Well, that was normal because, for instance, my role was also overseeing mental health.
Okay.
In the last institution, it was called the Special Needs Unit, but we would call it the Mental Health Unit. But there's what's actual designation through the Department of Public Welfare, where you lock people up even within prison. So you can 51, or that's California, 302 them. That's involuntary hold, and
Okay.
it's really sparse in a prison setting. It's really bad. So there are a couple institutions that have what are called technically mental health units. And those are overseen by the Department of Public Welfare. But on grounds of each institution, I'm going to assume it's the same across most states now. But in Pennsylvania, every institution has a specialized unit to protect those that are more vulnerable. So those with severe mental illness, those that may be trans, right? We all now are talking about that term, even though technically there's no such thing as trans.
Yeah.
So in looking up mental health roster, you're going to tap into the entire mainframe. Well, that also means I have available to me, if I'm on psych staff, with a click of the button, I can bring up all sex offenders. No outside researcher is going to have available that kind of access to that kind of pool of information that's within an actual department. So I quickly realized I had available to me information that an outside researcher, an academic researcher would give his eye teeth for. Right? If you're researching predators, it's a very lengthy process to get into a prison and to sit down with someone. And why I bring that up, it really matters, because think about what we know about sexual predators. It's usually from the literature. And that's where most of us stop. I did. Before working in prison, I knew nothing about sex offenders. That wasn't my background. Working with survivors was.
Okay.
And kids in the system. Suddenly I find myself working in a prison system, recruited to start the nation's first intensive treatment program in long-term solitary confinement. So the Hannibal Lecter kind of individuals, that was my client. Okay, those were my clients. Okay, through that, I gained or accrued more clinical contact hours in that long-term solitary confinement environment than any single psychology staff member in the US or Canada. Again, I'm not published, but you'll notice.
Now, is this national?
Correct.
Wow,
so I've been saying that publicly. Nobody's challenged me on it because everybody knows. Everybody in the industry knows. Okay, I would accrue in a single day more clinical contact hours than the average psychology staff member would accrue in that environment in a month.
That's
because it's so intensive. No psychology staff member wants to, the phrase was get in and get out. So unless somebody's ever worked in a prison environment, they won't understand the intensity of what's called segregation or restricted housing unit. It's a very unique environment. I call it's the closest thing to hell you'll ever find, and that is very true, because solitary confinement, we'll do a number on guys, and that is really what caused the necessity to hire somebody to create this kind of unit. Pretty much all the psych staff in Pennsylvania, the Department of Corrections, they were going to go on strike. They weren't going to touch this kind of unit, because they also know if you open up a specialized unit, the way prisons work, they do what's called horse trading, because each prison only has a capacity, and each prison is interested in offloading their worst inmates because they are problematic. They will take a lot of time. We have cell extractions, we have misconducts. So you can have one inmate that will cause a lot of overtime on the part of staff. And so every prison is interested in getting rid of those guys. So those are the behavioral management problems. So if there's a new kind of program that's opening or a new unit, it doesn't really matter what you describe it on paper. Behind the scenes, you have what's called horse trading among wardens or superintendents. We're going to bargain. I'll send you this guy if you send me that. Okay. So though it was intended for mental health inmates, what we had was a lot of just straight up behavioral health guys that had been in solitary confinement even up to 10, 12, 13 years because they don't play nice in general population. So these are colorful individuals. So as I opened up that unit, we already had received some of the most notorious inmates in the entire state of Pennsylvania, and I was to work with them. And the goal was to get them out uncuffed, or what they called unsecured. So the word secure in a prison environment means they're cuffed up. So in that kind of environment, it's 2-on-1. So that kind of sets the stage for those that I would begin to work with. And a significant number of them had harmed women in various ways. My introduction to the concept of the role or the idea that pornography played a significant role was actually seeing the Bundy interview live. I'm old enough. So I remember in the 70s, he was in Florida. He was going to the electric chair and he gave one interview. Right? A whole lot of people, a whole lot of outlets wanted an interview with Ted Bundy. He only gave one. It was through his attorney. He reached out to Dr. James Dobson, who had served on the Attorney General's Commission under Reagan, I believe, the Commission on Pornography. They had filled that commission with both those that were against pornography or those that saw the dangers and those that were trying to downplay it. Larry Flint of Penthouse, I believe, was on that. So you have these two sides, and because what was on the line is they were going to craft or propose what would then possibly become legislation clamping down on pornography. So the pornographers wanted to make sure that nothing really significant came out of it, but there was still a lot of significant information. The most significant thing was that pornography is addictive. By nature, it is addictive. When Ted Bundy sat down with James Dobson, and in one of my interviews with Alex Aaron, I unpack his statements. And he's very careful. I know there was a recent movie made, and people have tried to say, well, he was blowing smoke near the end. Okay. What I would say is, because I worked with a lot of lifers, it's very interesting. Most people that have a lot of opinions have never worked in a prison, let alone with lifers. When you're assessing veracity, and I'm also certified in the Harris Psychopathy Checklist, so I'm expected to be able to discern whether or not somebody's blowing smoke. Okay.
Yeah.
Those that want to play what Ted Bundy said typically are doing so because they don't like the implications of what he said. So I would say this: if somebody's going to go against what Bundy was saying, as far as the warning of the addictive nature of pornography, they're probably doing so because they're into porn themselves.
Yeah.
Bottom line. So Ted Bundy was very clear. Right. And Ted Bundy wasn't getting out of it. And that matters. Right. If there was some reason for him to leverage that last article, that last interview. Okay. I would say because that's what psychopaths do. He wasn't getting out of it. And he disclosed additional bodies. Now, psychopaths want power and control. They dangle it over, they'll take it to their grave. They want to be able to stay in control all the way to the end. Everything that Ted Bundy went against that. So he didn't gain anything from it. So what I suggest to people is posit the idea, or maybe we can posit the idea that maybe you have a man, for whatever reason, at the end of his life, wanted to begin the process of offloading his conscience. And so now he's going to disclose bodies that he didn't have to, could have taken in the grave. And the issue of pornography. And so what he said was this. He said he was raised in a relatively normal home. I've seen snippets of the interviews. Even his mother was called to testify. There's no real indication of overt abuse. Okay. So Ted Bundy said that he came across a magazine, I guess a detective magazine, but back then it was just Playboy and then I guess occasional these detective magazines. He said that did it.
I've never heard of detective magazines.
It's really snuff.
Okay.
So it's investigating. There used to be also comic book form, but it's investigating murders of women.
Oh.
Okay. So he said that got him hooked. And then the progression started.
How did this moment come about?
That's the question of the hour, and one that not only people much more intelligent than I have been working on for for years, but one that I've been working on for years and trying to understand. Is there enough time to explain it all? I don't know. I think I understand it, though. Understand what happened to me, to the extent that I can see how certain feelings and ideas developed in me to the point where I began to act out on them. Certain very violent and very destructive feelings.
Let's go back then to those roots. First of all, you, as I understand it, were raised in what you consider to have been a healthy home.
Absolutely.
You were not physically abused, you were not sexually abused, you were not emotionally abused.
No, no way. And that's part of the tragedy of this whole situation, is because I grew up in a wonderful home with two dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. A home where we as children were the focus of my parents' lives, where we regularly attended church, 2 Christian parents who did not drink, they did not smoke, there was no gambling, there was no physical abuse or fighting in the home. I'm not saying this was Leave It to Beaver.
It wasn't a perfect home.
Well, no, I don't know that such a home exists, but it was a fine, solid Christian home, and nobody, I hope no one will try to take the easy way out and to try to blame or otherwise accuse my family of contributing to this, because I know, and I'm trying to tell you as honestly as I know how, what happened, and I think this is a message I want to get across. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12 or 13, certainly, that I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store, the local drugstore, the softcore pornography, what people call softcore. But as I think I explained to you last night, Dr. Dobson, in an anecdote, that as young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across pornographic books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. And this also included such things as, let's say, detective magazines and more hardcore.
Those that involve violence.
Yes, yes, yeah. And this is something I think I want to emphasize, is the most damaging kinds of pornography. And again, I'm talking from personal experience. Hard, real, personal experience. The most damaging kinds of pornography are those that involve violence and sexual violence, because the wedding of those two forces, as I know only too well, brings about behavior that is just too terrible to describe.
Now, walk me through that. What was going on in your mind at that time?
Okay, before we go any further, I think it's important to me, and the people believe what I'm saying, to tell you that I'm not blaming pornography and not saying that it caused me to go out and do certain things. And I take full responsibility for whatever I've done and all the things that I've done. That's not the question here. The question and the issue is how this kind of literature contributed and helped mold and shape the kinds of violent behavior.
It fueled your fantasies, didn't it?
Well, in the beginning, it fuels this kind of thought process. Then, at a certain time, it's instrumental in what I would say crystallizing it, making it into something which is almost like a separate entity inside. And at that point, you're at the verge, or I was at the verge of acting out on these kinds of thoughts.
Now, I really want to understand that. You had gone about as far as you could go in your own fantasy life with printed material, and you made or printed and video or film
magazines, yeah, what have you. Yeah.
And then there was the urge to take that little step or big step over to a physical event.
And it happened in stages, gradually. It doesn't necessarily, not to me at least, happen overnight. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with the sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
How long did you stay at that point before you actually assaulted someone?
Well, yeah, you see, that is a very delicate point in my own development, and we're talking about having reached the point or a gray area that surrounded that point over a course
You don't remember
of years.
How long that
was?
was?
I would say a couple of years. And what I was dealing with there were very strong inhibitions against criminal behavior or violent behavior that had been conditioned into me, bred into me in my environment, in my neighborhood, in my church, in my school. Things which said, no, this is wrong. I mean, even to think of it is wrong, but certainly to do it is wrong. And I'm on that edge, and you might say the last vestiges of restraint. The barriers to actually doing something were being tested constantly and assailed through the kind of fantasy life that was fueled largely by pornography.
Do you remember what pushed you over that edge? Do you remember the decision to go for it? Do you remember where you decided to throw caution to the wind?
Again, when you say pushed, I know what you're saying. I don't want to infer again.
I understand that.
That I was some helpless kind of a victim, and yet we're talking about an influence that is the influence of violent types of media and violent pornography, which was an indispensable link in the chain of behavior, the chain of events that led to the behaviors, to the assaults, to the murders, and what have you. It's a very difficult thing to describe. The sensation of reaching that point where I knew that it was like something had, say, snapped, that I knew that I couldn't control it anymore, that these barriers that I had learned as a child, that had been instilled in me, were not enough to hold me back with respect to seeking out and harming somebody.
Would it be accurate to call that a frenzy, a sexual frenzy?
Well, yes, that's one way to describe it. A compulsion, a building up of this destructive energy. Another factor here that I haven't mentioned is the use of alcohol. But I think that what alcohol did, in conjunction with, let's say, my exposure to pornography, was alcohol reduced my inhibitions. At the same time, the fantasy life that was fueled by pornography eroded them further.
In the early days, you were nearly always about half drunk when you did these things. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Was that always true?
I would say that was generally the case, almost without exception.
All right, if I can understand it now, there's this battle going on within. There are the conventions that you've been taught. There's the right and wrong that you learned as a child. Mm-hmm. And then there is this unbridled passion fueled by your plunge into hardcore violent pornography. And those things are at war with each other.
Yes.
And then with the alcohol diminishing the inhibitions, you let go.
Well, yes, and to you can summarize it that way, and that's accurate, certainly. And it just occurred to me that some people would say that, well, I've seen that stuff and it doesn't do anything to me. And I can understand that. Virtually everyone can be exposed to so-called pornography, and while they're aroused to it to one degree or another, not go out and do anything wrong.
Well, addictions are like that. They affect some people more than they affect others.
Well,
but there is a percentage of people affected by hardcore pornography in a very violent way, and you're obviously one of them.
That was a major component, and I don't know why I was vulnerable to it. All I know is that it had an impact on me that was just so central to the development of the violent behavior that I engaged in.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
Well, again, please understand that even all these years later, it's very difficult to talk about it, and reliving it through talking about it is difficult, to say the least. But I want you to understand what happened. It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible. To wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, and with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment, absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
You really hadn't known that before?
There is just absolutely no way to describe, first, the brutal urge to do that kind of thing, and then what happens is once it has been more or less satisfied and recedes, you might say, or spent, that sense, that kind of energy level recedes, and basically I became myself again. And I want people to understand this too, and I'm not saying this gratuitously because it's important people understand this, that basically I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out at bars or a bum, or I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with him, and just tell. I mean, I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life, except for this one small but very potent and very destructive segment of it that I kept very secret and very close to myself and didn't let anybody know about it. And part of the shock and horror from my dear friends and family years ago when I was first arrested was that there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the all-American boy. And I mean, I wasn't perfect, but I want to be quite candid with you. I was okay. Okay, I was. The basic humanity and basic spirit that God gave me was intact, but unfortunately it became overwhelmed at times. And I think people need to recognize that it's not some kind of those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands. And we grew up in regular families. And pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. It snatched me out of my home. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children. And as good a Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there is no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in a society that tolerates.
You feel this really deeply, don't you? Ted, outside these walls right now, there are several hundred reporters that wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
And you asked me to come here from California because you had something you wanted to say. This hour that we have together is not just an interview with a man who's scheduled to die tomorrow morning. I am here and you're here because of this message that you're talking about right here. You really feel that hardcore pornography and the doorway to it, softcore pornography, is doing untold damage to other people and causing other women to be abused and killed the way you did others.
Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what Jon Q. Citizen thinks about this. But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
So I had heard that, of course, as I was probably junior high or high school, saw the interview. That made an impression on me. But I would not have anticipated I'd ever work in a prison. So in the back of my mind, as I'm walking into working with these guys, the one thing I was deeply steeped in was working with survivors. So I know the impact these guys have had. I'm going to make sure they are aware of it. That was part of my own personal mission and professional mission. But also then having come across Judith Riesman, and she and I became fast friends and close colleagues the last 2 years of her life. She died at the beginning of COVID, just after her booster. But she was the one to unmask Alfred Kinsey and reveal that he was an abject fraud. He was paid for by the CIA and the Rockefeller Foundation. He was a bug scientist and entomologist that suddenly rises to fame. And in his experiments, and it's gotten in the literature, and so now we all use phrases such as children are sexual from birth. Where did we get that phrase? That was from Kinsey.
Yeah.
Kinsey had pedophiles abusing kids using a stopwatch. If we say, oh, yeah, a 2-year-old takes 6 minutes to come to climax, and the writhing is really not what it is, it's just they're enjoying it. Okay, that's called child abuse. So all of Kinsey's work is predicated upon child abuse. So when she referenced that as well, then I realized, okay, we have a degree of deviance, even before I really figured out what that term was, but we have a degree of darkness among this population that are willing to do anything to kids once you start to get into certain levels. And pornography, based upon what Bundy said, pornography is probably behind it. So as I was there for 11 years, as I was interviewing these guys, and you think about all the heinous people that end up going to prison, the last we see of them is they're being escorted out of court, they're put in a van, put in a car, and off they go. And if you were to ask the average person, well, where are they going? Well, they're going to prison. What happens? Well, they're going to be in trouble. Okay, why? Well, they might get stabbed. But if you were to ask them, well, tell me what happens in an hour. Tell me the admission process. Tell me what's going to happen with their property. Tell me after they're strip searched. Tell me what happens. Tell me that day. Tell me who gets assigned to them. Who goes and visits their cell. Suddenly, you're going to have crickets. All these people that claim to be very knowledgeable have never worked in a prison.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, academic researchers haven't worked in a prison. And the reason I bring that up is an academic researcher will have to apply to be able to gain access. They're either going to ask for specific inmates or just general inmates. They're probably going to have at best a few hours, maximum for a couple of days. So we're talking about 9 hours.
Yeah.
To do research on the world's greatest liars. And what the researchers don't know is the guys are practicing for parole by using this interview. And these guys also know that the researcher is going to be enamored enough and take at face value what's just been disclosed, so that the researcher is going to go back and write an article. Now we have scientific or academic research findings. I'm not minimizing all academic research, but when it comes to pedophiles, when it comes to sex offenders, it's really important to understand if I give them the benefit of the doubt, I've already been played. I'm currently a sex offender treatment provider. I've been working now total of 15 years with this population, going on 3 years now out in the community. I've just started my fourth. I'm almost one of the largest providers in South Carolina. Okay, I just started my fourth group. I'm up to about 50 men. I still have more access than an academic researcher to their crimes and backgrounds. And compared to the prison, I have no information. So when we see, meaning if I'm an academic researcher, how am I going to interview pedophiles?
Oh, I get it. I thought you meant you personally, and I was.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
Speaking of,
right?
yeah,
meaning they're going to have to volunteer. Somehow they're going to have to come to my office if I'm an academic researcher. What do they bring to verify anything they're going to say? They're not bringing anything with them. To what extent can I go online and look up anything about them? I can go on, maybe look up criminal history. I can tell you the vast majority of researchers are not looking up the back criminal histories of these guys. Plus, what's on paper is not what they were charged with. Right? What they're charged with is a boatload of stuff, probably that reflected reality. What they're they either took a plea deal that they pled guilty to. Everything is pled down. And I have 3 guys in my groups right now that on paper, they have no sex offense.
Wait, they plead. That's why.
Assault.
Okay.
Because the courts don't clog up the process. It's a lengthy process. It's pathetic in my estimation, but it's the way the world works. And so a guy could have 27,000 images of child rape porn. He's given 5 counts. Of those 5 counts, we're going to let him plead away 3. So we're going to charge him 2 to 5. Or he can go to court and possibly look at 50 to 75 years. Take it to a jury trial. That's how the process works. So, and these guys will, or plead it down to indecent assault. Something like that. So on paper, and this is my concern about churches, because churches are very naive. I understand that because I was involved in church work early on. Most churches will never do a significant background check, number one. But if you do a background check on these guys, you're never going to know really how much was pled away. You're never going to know the kind of images that were found on their electronics. You're not going to know what they were into. And you're not going to know how much pornography was involved in every single case. So as I was working with the guys, whether in general population, so I worked with the guys in long-term solitary, then also did high-end, low-intensity treatment in general population that varies not based upon offense. Typically, it's based upon, the high and low intensity is based upon what's called risk assessment, the static 99, which is very flawed for pedophiles. It actually gives them bonus points. It's really sad. At some point, I actually have an alternative assessment that I could launch, but I just don't have the resources to do it. The presumption is that, and it's based upon some of this flawed research, that if somebody has perped on a child, they have low self-esteem, so they're not as much of a threat. If somebody, that's not true, by the way.
So is this risk assessment to get into general population or for release, or both?
No, I'm sorry, that's for sex offender treatment. So a guy will go through an assessment. I should describe this, but suffice it to say, though, and sorry for the circumlocution here, Caitlin, but the issue of pornography, in the back of my mind, I knew based upon what Judith Reisman said and based upon what Ted Bundy had said, that pornography is going to be in the mix in a significant way. So as I've been working with guys over the years, but especially the guys that were more heinous, the guys that were in for a long period of time, as I would stop by their cells day after week after month, so that's not just a 3-hour little time frame.
Yeah.
That's how you're going to get to know them. Eventually they'll start to disclose. And every one of them was willing to finally disclose how much pornography they got into. So I can assure people that 100% of every man, that by the time he perpetrated a sex offense, he was deeply steeped in pornography 100% of the time. 100% of pedophiles, without exception, are arrested or busted with child rape porn, and about 98% for the distribution or dissemination of that same material. So you don't have, ever since the 70s, you don't have sex offending without pornography. Now, people will quickly jump on that and say, Uhler, what about, prior to pornography and the internet? What I tell people is this: the issue is deviance. I can describe that, but the issue is deviance. That's what causes men to offend. That's what's been here through the beginning of time. Pornography and the internet supercharges that process. So we are unleashing sexual predators now at a rate that we've never seen before. And that's why you can see the ages of perpetrators that are getting younger, down to 14-year-old boys and 12-year-old boys. Okay. Has it always been the case throughout human history? Of course, but not like this. Because now these kids have access to material they've never had access to in their entire life or in the history of the world, because of the internet and because of pornography. So they're deeply steeped in this prior to offending. And so porn is the number one common denominator. And it'll take a man where he never thought he would go. So once a guy's in prison, that process as far as assessing, if he has a sex offense, he's going to have to take, at least in Pennsylvania, he's going to have to take sex offender treatment in order to be eligible for parole. A guy can refuse and max his sentence out. So in most states, you'll notice that a guy will be given 2 numbers. He's going to do 5 to 10. He's going to do 10 to 20. Okay. A guy is eligible for parole in most states based upon one of 2 things: either quote unquote good time. California, I believe, has that. And I don't know, there's an equation that for however many days they behave themselves, they get X number of days knocked off their sentence. In Pennsylvania, they do it based upon half time. So once a man reaches halfway through his sentence, he's eligible for parole. Now, if he's been screwing up, parole won't see him. But per statute, he has to be seen by parole. Now, parole doesn't have to let him out. The guy can see parole, every single year for the next 15 years, and they give them what are called hits. I'll see you in 2 more years. So a guy has to wait 2 more years, 1 to 2 more years, depending. Okay, so, but the one thing that is guaranteed in Pennsylvania, there's mandatory programming depending upon what he did. So if there was violence involved, there will be violence prevention. there are a lot of different kinds of groups, but if there was a sex offense, he's going to take sex offender treatment unless he bargained that away and wasn't then convicted technically of a sex offense. So those on the sex offender list for the Department of Corrections, those of us that would do treatment would then first assess them for risk using this assessment instrument. It's a simple 10 question, and it's inadequate for pedophiles. But then based upon the number of points they get on this 10-item scale, if they reach 5 points or more, they go into high intensity. If it's less than that, they go into low intensity. They didn't have moderate intensity. And the difference was the amount of components of their treatment as far as in the curriculum. So you either have a 1-year or a 2-year stint in sex offender treatment. Sexually violent predators, I headed up that unit. There were 2 at the time. They could go into a specialized treatment, and instead of spending 2 years, they could spend 1, but it's a standalone 65-bed unit where they have treatment every single day. And I found the treatment to be inadequate, so I enhanced it, and I was kind of got myself in trouble because I enhanced it, but I don't care. To see a bunch of guys that are sexually violent predators sitting around playing cards, that was too much for me to handle. So I added additional treatment.
But do you think it's possible to rehabilitate these men?
Very few.
Okay.
I think there's about 8 categories, or what I noticed. So I have it's a continuum. So there's about 8 different categories. In some of the podcasts I've done, I've shared these. And the most mild category, and I don't use the term mild because I'm minimizing offense, because I'm all about survivors. But when you think of what can be done to people, the more mild, and I'll describe why I use that term, I think there's hope for that kind of person. Then you have all the way to the pedophiles and the sadistic pedophiles. No hope for pedophiles. They have seared their conscience. Okay. Nobody becomes a pedophile by accident. Nobody was born that way. It is a lie. There are no minor attracted persons. Those are lies. Those are urban legends. Those are being crafted by agenda-driven researchers that make up these terms, float these things out there, and people begin to, right? It's a battle for the narrative. And I'm here to tell people that no man was attracted to a child's body. There's nothing attractive about a child's body. By the time a man gets into deviance, and the best definition I know of deviance came from me, because I finally figured it out. And I was asking my colleagues over time, because everybody would use this term in sex offender treatment about deviance. And I would start to, well, what is that? Well, you know, they'd all say, I said, well, what? Well, it's like way outside the norm. Oh, deviations outside. Yeah. Well, this is what they're really into, but nobody could define it. So in this field, everybody uses this term deviance, but I've never found one good working definition, but I have it just because I worked hard to try to figure out. So here it is. Deviance is the polar opposite of a normal man in this sense.
Oh, okay.
A normal man can only get an erection when he knows that his partner is enjoying herself. He cares about the other person. In those contexts, we'll use the idea of setting the mood. But let's say you have a husband and wife or partner together, the guy's ready to climax, and all of a sudden she says, oh, there are spots on the ceiling. I really have to clean the ceiling. Okay. What would happen? Okay.
You would lose it, yeah.
Right. And all of a sudden, as a matter of fact, in sex offender treatment, I talk about this just because the guys know that I know. And I had one guy who was pretty funny. He was in the more mild categories, but all of a sudden he does this thing. He goes, oh, exactly. Okay. So she, quote unquote, ruined the mood. Now, I'm not blaming her. It's just the reality that a normal man, his ability to enjoy himself depends upon the extent to which he knows his partner is enjoying herself. Okay, that's a normal man. That's normal attraction. But then you start to, it's easiest to think in terms of getting off the straight and narrow, and now you're going downhill on the slippery slope. The first stage that a guy will get into is lust. Every guy battles that. But what is lust? Is starting the beginning of the objectification process. Lust is now more about me than the other person. Now it's more about my needs. Okay. That still doesn't make a sex offender. That's still the common battle out there. But the problem is, those of us that are not sex offenders, we project onto sex offenders as though they're normal. And so we give them the benefit of the doubt, and they're able to play on that. The question is, if a guy were to continue to go downhill, there's various stages he's going to progress through. He's going to progress through, eventually, it's going to shift from care and concern to, now it's more about me, that's lust, to you owe me. Now you're really into objectification. How about this? Well, I paid for her dinner. She owes me.
Yeah.
Okay. It then is going to get eventually into power and control. We're going to get into manipulation, then power and control. Even high schoolers, unfortunately, have gotten into the, right, how far did you get? Have no concern about the girl. How far did you get with her? Okay. And that's what the world pushes. It pushes all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You're still not into deviance yet. If a guy goes far enough, he will eventually lose sight of it. It's not even lose sight of it. He will morph from being what I just described as normal, where you are concerned about the effect you're having upon your partner, to now you can only, once a guy enters into deviance, he can only get aroused knowing he's having a negative effect upon his victim. That's very different. So at first, a guy can only get an erection knowing that he's pleasuring his partner. Now it gets inverted. It's like a fighter jet going through a fog bank and gets inverted. Now everything is polar opposite. Once a guy gets into deviance, he no longer is normal. He's now a predator. But it's a continuum, so that hopefully at the beginning of those stages, you can reach a guy and help him to begin to realize how far he has fallen off the straight and narrow onto the slippery slope. So he can begin to realize he's risking becoming someone he'll never recognize. And another important piece is this: as a guy is going downhill like that, he is losing the desire to ever come back. He's losing the desire to ever be any other way than the way he's becoming, and he actually wants to double down on that. That's deviance. So somebody who is deviant, a man that is deviant, is not after anything to do with the person or the relationship. What drives him, what he gets off on, is knowing that he is harming. He's perpetrating psychological and physical harm. If he can't harm someone, he can't get an erection. That's what people need to understand. And that's why it's really serious when we start to see these men that are now so emboldened as to come out in public, dress in women's underwear and drag, and try to gain access to kids, right? A guy can dress in underwear, women's underwear, and drag all he wants. Keep it in the club. Even Kitty Demure has come out and said that. He's a drag artist. Okay. No normal man seeks to have access to kids. As a matter of fact, in marriage and family counseling, the most common two complaints you'll hear from a wife typically is going to be this: he doesn't talk to me, or he only wants sex with him. But typically it's going to be two things: he doesn't talk to me, and he won't spend time with the kids. Unfortunately, a normal man, I'm not saying this is right, But we normal men need to be reminded, get outside of ourselves enough, go play ball with the kids, go play catch, play a board game, right?
Yeah.
Spend time with the kids. Most guys say, well, what do I do? I'm bored. Okay, so I'll still put that in the category of normal. I'm not going to say it's right. They need to be coached. They need to be reminded that, hey, your kids, they're your kids. They need somebody in their life.
Yeah.
But so if you have a man that seems unusually interested in gaining access to kids, hanging around kids, seeming like a kid magnet, let alone, so those are in churches. Those are the dangerous guys in churches. Let alone really focused on their sex and sexuality, you got a predator.
Yeah.
As simple as that.
It's wild to me that we've suddenly are pushing that there's there's queer children. It's as a world, like a Western world conversation. It's could you imagine that this?
It's a predator's dream come true, right?
Yeah.
Because what does a predator need in order to access a kid? He needs adults that are clueless. He needs adults that have no discernment. He needs adults. This is the ideal thing. And this is why my greatest concern in churches, the next is trans deception in schools and sports and all that. He simply needs adults that are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Now,
Yeah.
should we become jaded? No, I don't think that's the answer. But we've been taught to no longer have discernment. And that's what this onslaught of the trans deception does. It causes everyone to turn the dial down on their intuition. Well, that's what predators do with their intended targets of opportunity. And so little do parents realize that the perps, the predators, look for the trans flags because they know if schools have trans flags out there, they have adults that are brain dead. They have adults that are going to welcome them. And we think that predators have some bottom line beyond which they wouldn't cross. So it's almost like, well, no self-respecting predator would ever dress in women's underwear and drag. That would just be beneath him, right? But people don't know they're thinking
that's
that
wild
way.
To me that they don't right. I don't understand how people's blind spots. Yeah.
Right. Or no self-respecting perpetrator would purposely, in order to gain access to women's locker room and showers, they wouldn't purposely join the women's swim team, would they?
Yeah.
So we think Leah Thomas is all about the medals. He doesn't care about the medals. He's gaining access to the locker room.
Yeah.
That's what all
He's
these
clearly a porn addict.
Right. And that second account that was found, the same thing with Sam Britton.
Yeah.
So if you really want to see them go nuclear, tell them they can't take, number one, tell them they can't go in the locker room. Tell them also you can't take your cell phone in there. They're videotaping all these women. That's why all the pictures of men, cross-dressing men, right? I don't think I've seen one picture online of a woman who has transitioned to a guy taking a picture of herself in the men's room.
No, you're right.
You're
right. That's a really good point, actually. I hadn't thought about that.
Okay, but these are trophies. So they are broadcasting to one another. And part of it is then these different guys will know, where are the easiest settings? So Drag Queen Story Hour really is a way of perpetrators sensing and detecting the degree of resolve of a community. Which communities are going to be easy pickings? If I'm a predator, if all I have to do is dress in women's underwear and drag, if I'm welcomed into the local community library, then I know the mayor, I know the city council or the town council, they're user-friendly. So I know those schools are going to be very easy. And so we'll begin the process.
Yeah. And you said something very unnerving about the last stop on the road to depravity. And it's boys, castrated boys, I believe you said, and the murder of castrated boys. And Redux exposed
That's
the Unic archives,
That's right.
and that I can't remember his name, but I think he's a UC Berkeley professor. Part of the guidance for WPATH was Unic identity for minors. And so I think this is a really important topic because it's being institutionalized.
That's right.
Why is it that that's the last stop? I mean, it's not like everyone's going to get there, but if
Right.
that's the end result, right?
Right. In understanding the mind of the predator, or in order to understand it, people need to, again, it's best viewed on that slippery slope concept. And in my work with guys, this is the concept that we use. And you can see it that they know that I know. So my groups become very real because these guys know they're not getting out of anything. And they know that they're going to have to be real about their porn use. And their porn use is going to match each stage of deviance. So as a guy progresses downward, his porn will change. That's why when a guy's finally busted for murder, for serial rape and murder, what you will inevitably find him looking at is the same material.
Oh, wow.
The end of the line is called snuff porn. Well, actually, there's one worse now. Neck, or what else they call it? They keep coming up with these, but necrophilia. Mort porn, mortuary porn.
Oh, that's what they
And
call it.
as
Ugh.
graphic as this stuff is, because I've trafficked in this, meaning that, I dealt with this stuff for 15 years. I still have to be mindful that those that are hearing it for the first time. But it's important for people to understand that you cannot separate the progression downward into deviance from what's happening in the psyche of a man. And he's becoming a predator. And he's becoming darkened. So that means his appetites, his motivations, his interests, his inclinations, his drives are no longer normal. Just like a predator, 24/7, he's calculating and he's planning and he's thinking about how to access victims. But he can look increasingly normal. That's where I differ from Robert Hare when he created the PCL-R, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. One of the indicators is antisocial characteristics. Like antisocial personality disorder is one that can be summarized as part of the cluster B personality disorders. It can be summarized in that it goes against societal norms. This is a guy that has a hard time fitting in. It's born to be wild. It's the bad boy. It's the guy that's just not going to be constrained by norms. I would submit that's very compared to all of them out there as far as the psychopaths, very few are like that. Why? He's not going to get very far. Because we all know, right?
That's
you
really
see
good
a
point,
guy
yeah.
with a bunch of tats. I'm not going to rag on any guys with tattoos, okay? But a guy with tattoos, that smoking out, smoking in the boys' room, and the guy that just looks like Hell's Angels, we're typically not shocked when the guy gets arrested, but we're
Right.
probably not going to make him we're not going to put him on the board of directors of a corporation. We're not going to put him on the elder board of a church. We're not going to entrust him with a lot of stuff. Why? Because one look says it all, sort of thing. There's a sort of thing. There's enough about him that says, no, you know what? He's just not going to be a good fit. Okay. Robert Hare himself kind of revealed that the issue of antisocial personality characteristics should really not necessarily, it's part of the PCL-R, but it should really be, I think, supplanted by a couple of other characteristics. Because what he said is, if he hadn't studied psychopaths in prison, and he actually didn't, he didn't work in a prison. So the subjects came out of a prison that he scanned the brains. But he said if he hadn't worked in prison, he would have worked on Wall Street. He went on to write a book called, well, he's written a few books, but one called Snakes in Suits. It's a great cover. It has a guy with a regular business suit with a big boa constrictor around his neck. Okay.
Oh,
Well, the fact that he wrote the book Snakes in Suits tells you that this is not a rare characteristic.
no.
As you climb the corporate ladder, you're going to find more and more psychopaths. There's two kinds, a white-collar psychopath and a bloody psychopath. As a matter of fact, psychopathy really is boiled down to three characteristics. It all has to do with conscience. So they don't have a conscience. Why? Because they have gotten rid of their conscience. Why? They've overridden their conscience. Why? They didn't want it. But it took a lot of work. And that's why there is no such thing as a minor attracted person. Okay? Pedophiles are not born. And they did not start with child material. They started with material with adults. And they worked their way downward. And once they got to a point, the inmates call it barely legal material. Guys with adult victims will back away then. They won't keep going down in age. But you notice it's right at that age where the adult women are dressed to look younger, the young kids are dressed to look older, and it all converges at what they call barely legal. The pedophiles continue downward on purpose. And the inmates in prison, the reason why they want to beat the hell out of the pedophiles is they know that this minor attracted person stuff is a bunch of crap. They know what it takes to become a pedophile, and that's why they want to harm these guys, because they know that no normal man will perp on anybody younger than puberty. Now, I'm not suggesting it's right for the other guys, but it's very
Well, there's an element of biology there, though. I mean, I don't think it's right. There's an element there that I can follow the line of thought. Still don't think it's right. You know, we've changed socially. That's not acceptable anymore. And there's an innocence factor now, I think, for the 14, 15, 16-year-old, 17-year-old boy or girl, there's an innocent factor that maybe didn't exist before.
That's right.
So
even intuitively, the inmates understand that.
Yeah.
So as a guy is going downhill, now to your question, as far as the different kinds of porn, as he's getting worse and worse. For instance, when it gets into it moves from lust into objectification. For instance, you've gone from Playboy. I mean, it shows you how old I am, but now everybody laughs, but think about the concept. Playboy, that was the gateway drug, by the way. Okay, Playboy, then you had Penthouse, then you had Hustler, that was Larry Flint. That was pretty dramatic back then. You can see how far we've come.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the objectification process. But then you started to see the issue of BDSM. What is BDSM? Well, it has to do with power and control. That has nothing to do with relationship. It's not even lust. It's not even just attraction. Now you're actually starting to inflict harm. True BDSM is somebody's using methods upon another person that they used to use in the Middle Ages to extract information or a confession.
Yeah.
Let that sink in. That ain't normal.
No.
Think about the Spanish Inquisition. That was BDSM. Okay.
It really is unsettling how normalized that's becoming, and how it's like there's nothing healthy about that. Like I mean, I will be honest, as a person that's been abused, I had my own issues getting past that, but it's not. It was only because of conditioning.
Correct.
You know.
There we go. Right. And no normal guy, I tell women this all the time, they need to understand it. No normal guy is ever going to think to put his hand on your neck.
Yet that's becoming so much more common.
Right? This choking, what is that? That's a predator's dream come true. As a matter of fact, working with the guys in prison on the day that the movie 50 Shades came out, it was on Valentine's Day, on Friday. And since they had blocked TV, they could see the commercials. And so I asked them, I said, what do you guys think about this? So that became the discussion for the day. The consensus among the guys was this would make grooming all the more easy for them. So women are grooming themselves now. Women can't discern what is or isn't sexual assault.
Yeah, I went to see that film thinking I didn't read the book, and I left the theater about 20 minutes in.
There you go.
I was so upset because when I didn't know much about the story, and it seemed like it was like everyone was kind of selling it as sexual empowerment, and I was like, this is rape.
Correct.
It's rape and it's abuse, and it was horrifying to me that it was becoming this like lady porn or whatever and being sold that way.
That's right, the erotica stuff. But in that film, that guy's a psychopath. He's a white-collar psychopath.
Yes.
Okay. So as a guy gets further, as a matter of fact, if a guy suggests to a gal, let's say they go out to see that movie, I tell women, you can tell me the storyline. He can't tell me the storyline. Do you understand that? There's a big difference. So the one thing that all this trans crap has also done is in trying to blur the unique, I think, God-given differences between men and women, but because dealing with now deviant sex and sexuality, women need to understand the male brain and male sexuality by nature is different. All this is doing, the trans movement, all this has done is put women at risk because men haven't changed. And if a woman thinks a man is just the same as she is, and therefore you can do BDSM, what I tell a woman is this: you might want to update your will.
Yeah.
Because you have no clue who you're walking into a dungeon with. You think it's fun and games. I've worked with the men you think it's fun and games. So only women are losing because of this entire deviant push called the trans movement. Women are losing. So it's the greatest joke. I don't find it funny whatsoever, but that's all this is. Women are losing from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And every guy knows it. And that's why when I have guys that'll start running their mouths and posturing at me, I take a no holds barred approach, and they know it, and all they can do is keep getting me banned off of Twitter. I'm on another little suspension now. Okay, because they know
You're
know.
unsuspended again?
Oh yeah, because one of the perps I finally had to block and put in his place. He complained because I said the reason he follows James Canner is because he's hoping that by the time this perp gets busted, that Canner's material will get him off easy.
But was he the one that you were having that exchange with below my? That guy's a lunatic.
Well, his sexual deviant. There's 2 or 3 that have not let up because they know I've unmasked this whole thing. Yeah. And they're angry.
Yeah.
Deviant guys do not want the public understanding that the issue underlying all of this is porn, and that all of these guys are just sexual deviants, and they're playing the public for fools. They're playing this out they're loving this, and they're playing it to the hilt. And they will do anything. They will use any method to gain access to kids. And since now the name of the game is playing upon sympathies, a perpetrator perpetrators like a chameleon. So we think that no self-respecting guy or a sexual perpetrator would be so low as to.
Actually, I did think that for a little bit. When I was very naive at the start of this, when I thought most of these trans-identified men were gay and just had like internalized homophobia, there was a point in time that I thought that. But the vast majority of these men are straight. And I think a lot of people don't know that.
That's right.
Still, because I was naive and,
That's right. With these guys that we'll call trans. But again, there's no such thing as trans. They're just men and women, boys and girls that are sexually confused. Yeah. That's all. Okay. But the ones that are legitimate don't want to have any attention drawn to themselves.
No.
They're not the activists. They want to be left alone.
Yeah.
So these activists are straight guys that have just gotten into deviant porn and want to have access to kids.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
I mean, yeah, all of the people pushing gender medicine, all of them are AGP. I can't seem to find, except Chase Strangio, who's.
And an AGP, in my estimation, the term
transvestite.
It's just a deviant guy. It's a porn-fueled deviant guy. That's all it is, right?
Yeah.
And so they love the term AGP because now they have a term they can throw around. So as a matter of fact, I even reject the term fetish. They're just deviants. So if we get rid of all these labels and just say, you're just porn-fueled, you're a porn-fueled freak, a deviant guy, you're a pervert. Okay, the old-fashioned term. They hate it, but that's what cuts through the stuff. Now, and you were asking, okay, what about snuff porn? As the guy goes downhill, again, the activity is going to change. What he's looking at behind the scenes will be changing as well. That's typically going to precede what he's going to be doing. That makes sense. So guy's going to be consuming material first. It's going to break his own inhibitions down, override his conscience. Then he's going to begin to do it. You can't tell me a guy first dressed in women's underwear and then access porn about men dressing in women's underwear. No, he's starting to look at these guys. Then he thinks, oh, maybe I'll do this. Okay, so it's always the porn first. So when you look at these categories downward, it's going to go from the power and control, then to debasing. Now it's about humiliation and debasing. Alex Aaron was the first one to describe about the Latino, I forget even the term now, but the Latina abuse, where I don't know why it's categorized somehow. Dealing with the Latin American community, these deviant guys, they really want to humiliate their women on top of everything else. So they do all sorts of heinous stuff. This is where they're going to ejaculate on their faces. They're going to put dog bowls on. I mean, just utter degradation. Okay. That's a category they're moving into. They've already accessed that kind of porn. So the porn is accessed first, then the behavior is going to follow. It's then going to move into more of the genuine inflicting of, it's the beginning of trauma.
Yeah.
So now it is the taking of the unwitting person and tying them up. About that same time, you're going to see a couple of other kinds of porn accessed. In that phase, you're going to see anthropomorphic porn. So now you got furries. Okay.
Ugh.
And now you're going to see bestiality because it's a combination of the two.
Okay.
We haven't gotten
Sorry,
to child porn yet. So what's amazing, and if I hadn't worked with the sex offenders, I wouldn't have known this, that before a guy ever gets into child porn, guess what he's already into? Bestiality.
And
these are not mild-mannered men.
Wow. Do you notice different crimes being committed versus if they're like more into beta porn or alpha porn?
Probably. I hadn't really connected that because the majority of the guys that I deal with are more in you mean the aggressor versus the receiver.
Yeah, like they categorize themselves that way, but
it's typically going to be the aggressor that's going to perpetrate the crimes.
Okay.
So even think in a pride parade, a gay pride parade, we got the leather stuff. You see the submissive guys, those are not going to be the guys that will be perpetrating crimes against kids.
Really? I would have thought because AGP's like humiliation of themselves that they would be the ones to end up. So that's interesting.
I'm convinced that the AGPs, the majority of those guys, they're the dominant ones. They're not going to stay. Look at
really?
Sam
Okay.
Look at Sam Britton.
Yeah,
Look
you're right.
And Thomas.
Yeah, and the autogynephile.
Right? These guys don't stay submissive. That's a lie. That's what they want you to think or want us to think. No.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
The ones that were submissive were perped on as young kids.
Okay.
The ones that are dominant, they weren't perked on, because survivors do not become, they are protective. They do not become exploitive.
Okay. Wow, that's so interesting. Yeah, because they do like that, like manipulation of that, the being the submissive. I don't know. I've never watched porn. So
I
all I
haven't
learn
either.
is from people like you, or from you know, Roxy or Bunny, who used to be exploited. That's
Yeah.
how I'm like learning about all this stuff.
Yeah. No, the only thing I've ever gone on as far as accessing anything is, and it shows you how scary, just
Records.
Google. I do a Google search. When I get my screenshots, it's all I ever do. Now think about, if I'm doing that, what kids have access to.
Yeah. And
Where I've learned this
minimum,
stuff is from like Alex Aron and other women. So I'm very glad some women have tolerated going on and looking at the stuff.
I
But
can't do it. I can't bring my, even when it
there's no
pops up on a
way.
screen, it makes me, it just makes me feel so gross inside.
And then, of course, the criticism comes back at me. Well, Euler, that means you're criticizing stuff you've never seen. Yeah, in this case, you're right. But I can read you the police reports.
Yeah, all you have to do is look at data too about like, you know, the majority of women are trafficked. There's like pretty much all of them have been raped. You know, there's the average age of entry. The data around porn is enough to say it's really bad for society and terrible for women.
There's nothing good. It's a cancer.
No, yeah.
You know, Caitlin, you were asking about the snuff porn. After you get into the bestiality, after you get into the humiliation, after you get into the degradation, by the time a guy is into that, there's probably almost no hope coming back.
Okay.
Okay. So depending upon the kind of crimes he's now committing, probably no hope for him. The kind that there is hope for, I should reference, is the guy who was 18 or 19 who should have figured out, maybe I need to make new friends. I shouldn't still probably be hanging around the younger, maybe he was dating the 16-year-old. It was the senior and sophomore, you know, homecoming king and queen. He turned 18. She's still 16. He's dating the judge's daughter. And now the kid gets arrested for statutory rape. He will end up with the same label as a guy that's raping kids. He can actually end up on the sex offender registry. He can end up in my groups. So that's heartbreaking in a way.
Yeah.
I call that the young and the dumb. So I've had a number of those guys in my groups. Prison was enough for them, right? It kind of ruined their life in a way, because everything that society is reinforcing, he acted upon, yet he blew it. And so I've had those younger guys in my group that they're having to be in groups with these other kind of guys, and they're mortified.
That'll scare you straight. Yeah.
Right? Including some of the guys had their younger sisters molested by the likes of these same kind of guys. So it's a whirlwind for them. So it's those categories that I believe there's hope for. But when you get into the stuff that we're talking about, once a guy gets into, again, there's nothing, once you start humiliating your partner, you're not, you know, she's not enjoying it. So you've no longer become normal. Meaning this guy's getting aroused by the level of distress. He's no longer normal. And we haven't even gotten into then the stuff that we were just describing, the bestiality stuff. The next transition then is the actual raping of adults, and then eventually the child. Then the question is, what do you do with the victims? You're going to execute them. So that's snuff porn. And then guys that are having sex with dead bodies. So that's the necrophilia. So they call that mortuary porn. Okay. Along the way, you can see it starts to become darker, meaning just morally depraved. And you start to also see, it's not uncommon to see the different scenes where you have almost like satanic stuff. It's very common. There's a merging of that. The one thing I heard from the different guys that have perpetrated heinous offenses that are in for life, that I had hours and hours and hours to spend with, without me, in order to get really good, reliable information, you don't want to really lead in a conversation as you're talking to a guy. You want it just to kind of emerge or surface. And without exception, that's why it takes so long, because they don't trust you at first. But the one thing that was without exception is those guys that had body counts, they were into porn. They would tell me that something came over them just before they perpetrated the offense. Then something left them afterward. Think about Dennis Rader, BTK killer, when he's being interviewed. You can go online and find that interview. And BTK, he was an elder in a church, or very active in a church, while he's killing women. And so it's interesting to hear him talk about, well, those people in church that I used to go to. So it's interesting, he's referring to them kind of very detached now that he's in prison. He says, well, they kind of referenced that I had a demon. I don't know about that, but he says, I've called this thing Factor X. He says, and Factor X would come on me. So here, Dennis Rader doesn't want to call it a demon, but he's saying that there's this thing that influenced him. So without exception, these guys, the further you go into this, you're going to see it becomes darker in terms of there's a spiritual component. And that's where you also then get satanic ritual abuse down in there as well.
I mean, Bunny said the same thing. She said that particularly anal sex, that there's something like there's something that leaves the man and then comes back, that they're like not there anymore.
It wouldn't surprise me. Then that fits about, what about the castration of kids? Because by the time you're using kids, then it is all about marring and scarring and traumatizing the soul. You then also get into the cannibalistic stuff in there. Okay, that ain't normal. So the question is, what comes over somebody? I challenge anybody who's worked with this kind of population. Forget, the Sunday morning quarterback or whatever, Monday morning, some guy that has no actual forensic experience, right? Everybody can have an opinion. I simply ask people this: tell me how many hours you've spent behind bars working with this kind of guy. Suddenly it's crickets. Okay. Yeah. I'm up to probably about 14,000 clinical contact hours.
So, okay. Yeah, I mean,
yeah. So if somebody can log that many clinical contact hours, talk to me. What have you seen? I'm going to tell you that there is a very dark component, a very dark spiritual component. I come from a Christian perspective. I'll call it a satanic or demonic perspective.
I mean, I feel it too. Like it is demonic. There's something very demonic about it.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, how many times are we seeing, even within the trans movement stuff, how many times am I now seeing pentagrams on these different drawings and things? Well, pentagram is the number one symbol used in Satanism. Number two is the A for anarchy. Okay, so they're now putting out there. So if you bring to bear a spiritual component that is very dark, the question is, how long are you in control of that, or does it start to take control of you? And once it starts to take control of you, might it start to suggest certain things? Might it start to take things to the next level? So satanic ritual abuse, for instance, is taking it to a really significant level. It's something I never once believed, or once upon a time I didn't believe in it. Now I've worked with quite a few survivors. I have 2 right now that are the victims of satanic ritual abuse. Who perpetrates that? Men that get into the child porn, because now there's, by the way, they are psychopaths by that time. So what's a psychopath capable of doing? Anything, because he's sadistic. He gets off on not just power and control, but having the last word, last say, last laugh. So it's having a negative effect. That's what drives a psychopath.
Yeah.
You then have a dark component. There's an actual term that is in the training material, at least within the state of Pennsylvania. I'm licensed in 2 states, so I take both updated CEU courses. And in Pennsylvania, they now have through University of Pennsylvania in their training material. There's a new category of child abuse called ritualistic abuse. So this is nobody's opinion, this is just fact.
Yeah.
Okay. Ritualistic abuse is the abuse that is perpetrated by somebody who has regular and consistent access to a kid who does it time and time again. Okay, so there's consistency to that. That's called ritualistic abuse. By the time a man is doing that, he has no conscience. He is sadistic. He is a psychopath. If we are to then posit that by the time somebody's getting into that, they're getting darker morally, then it's not hard to suggest that a certain portion of those are going to start harmonizing with that darkness. If you're all about traumatizing a kid, and part of that, and that's how they know how to create what used to be called split personality, multiple personality, now it's dissociative identity disorder. IFS comes along and calls them parts. So they know how to create, they know how to shatter the personality. And the perpetrators will do this for a couple of different reasons. So not only is the young child splitting off for their own protection inadvertently, but then the perps know how to do this in order to ultimately keep the perps safe. The perps don't want to get busted. So what they do is they know the child is splitting off on the inside, so they will threaten one alter or one part, one personality, to keep other parts quiet, lest they, the perps, because the child only knows what the child knows, and these perps say, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, we'll always know where you are. And if anybody ever discloses, if anybody on the inside ever discloses, we will hurt little Kathy. And so in order to protect little Kathy, they don't realize, the person who now has multiple parts doesn't realize that the measure they're going to take to keep another part silent will be to kill themselves. So it's the ultimate insurance policy for the perpetrator to help enhance the personality splitting of the survivor. That's flat out evil. This is a psychopath that does this. The next step in psychopathy is harmonizing with evil. So you have some of those that perpetrate ritualistic abuse will then go on to get into dark stuff. And now they're getting off on it more, and it adds all the more dramatic effect, which will tie a kid up in knots. So now you will have adults that will actually dress the part. And that is even more difficult for a young person. They can't even comprehend it. But years later, if somebody such as myself, a therapist in trauma therapy, is working with a survivor and they start to remember some of these things, part of what you're having to help them through, because really they've been brainwashed. They've been unduly influenced, mentally and emotionally manipulated. You have to then work with the different parts who are convinced they are evil, that they themselves are demonic, because they can actually be raped by demon-possessed individuals, and demons will say they're coming inside these kids. So it's
I think that's true. Like, I do think the demons, like, I think that I had to get rid of evil demons when I was healing because they were put inside me. Yeah. I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, what I would say, well, and this will be, obviously more survivors, Caitlin will be listening to this. My own perspective is this, and there was a point in time where I believed that, because I worked with somebody that had 250 parts to them. And there were some parts that really were convinced. And so I was convinced because they had certain names, they came across in certain ways, until we decided to kind of take a whole group of them and send them to the abyss, kind of thing. And you know, there was a lot of sincerity in the primary person I was working with, the survivor. It seemed that it worked, until a couple of weeks later, she came back and she said, "Remember when we did that?" She said, "I think something." I said, "What?" She wanted to tell me, "I don't think it worked." And I said, "What?" Well, that's when I realized that think about a rape victim. It's a little bit sort of off what we were going to talk about, but hopefully this will be very helpful that those that have experienced this. Think about an adult, how traumatic being raped is for an adult. Okay, but with an adult brain and an adult mind, an adult ability to process trauma is still overwhelming.
Yeah.
How much more for a child, especially a child who is in an age and stage of imagination. They're very egocentric. Now, all the more an adult rape victim, number of things are going to be true. Immediately, they want to go take a shower. Why? They feel dirty, but they didn't do anything about it, but they feel dirty. They will then start to blame themselves, and they have to work through that. It's not their fault, but they have to work through that. They will then feel they're disconnected from it initially, but what they're going to have to work through is their rage. But that's the last thing they're in touch with. So we have a sense of being dirty. We have a sense of false guilt, and then we have a sense of rage. But if somebody is out of touch with their anger, because if they've only seen negative things happen from anger, then they're going to push it down, and that'll become anxiety and depression. But they'll still feel the intensity. Now, that's as an adult. So we could say that an adult rape survivor is burning with anger, has shame and false guilt, feels dirty. That's with an adult mind, an adult that's been raped. Now think about a child. How in the world is a child supposed to process that? On top of if the person raping them was demon possessed and a demon is talking to them and they can smell and says, I'm coming inside you. There's no way a child can figure that out. But fortunately, part of my background is steeped in what I believe is good, solid theology. And what I can assure anybody from the New Testament, you have some pictures, as it were, glimpses of how demons work in the Old Testament, the book of Job. David encountered some stuff in the Old Testament. It talks about how they were sacrificing children to demons, but you don't have dialogue per se, other than in the book of Job. It's where we see it is in the New Testament, and what I can tell people is this: you have it with Jesus, you have it with Paul. Anytime there's an encounter with a demon-possessed person, even the one that was legion, had a bunch in him, if you look at the exchange between Jesus and, let's say, the guy that had legion of demons in him, if you really count up the amount of words in that exchange, it's very brief. We don't have paragraphs. Jesus said, what's your name? And legion. And, have you come to destroy us before the time? He said, what's your name? We're legion. Don't send us to the pit. Send us in the pigs. So we've got about 3 or 4 sentences. Now, were there more? Maybe, but all things being equal, pretty brief. For having a legion of demons, that was a pretty brief discussion. Paul, he was being plagued by this demon-possessed girl who was being used by her owners. She was a slave girl, demon-possessed, to tell fortune. Well, however it happens, Paul's walking through the town. I think it's in Philippi. And somehow she finds out who he is, and it's almost like every morning she's following him, almost like a Twitter follow, taunting him. Well, he's tolerating this for a number of days. He finally's had enough one day. He turns around, looks at her, and he casts the demon out of her. Okay. We don't have a lot of the dialogue, but it was funny to say he got fed up. So it was kind of funny to think, right? And then all hell broke loose because the owners now of the slave girl knows that her powers are gone. And so a riot broke out. Those are really the only snippets that we see, other than Judas being Satan possessed twice. Kind of interesting. The 30 when he was paid off. Okay, that's all we have. And what I would say is, with such an important issue as whether or not somebody can be demon possessed. Okay, we also have a father whose child is being thrown into the flames, and the word child.
And then Mary Magdalene, right? She had to.
Okay, Mary Magdalene.
7,
but
yeah.
but she's an adult.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Right. So the question is this: can a child end up being demon possessed? And this will sound funny, against their will, because my premise is this, that you cannot be demon possessed against your will. I mean, you have to open up a door. That's why the majority of times that we see Jesus or Paul encountering demon possessed individuals, it's adults. Now, where you say the one, Jesus comes down from the mountain with Peter and John, and there's this dad whose child says girl. The question is how young? Probably not a young child. So what I would say is this: there are no incidents in the New Testament of young children being demon possessed. So what I think,
maybe it's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So what I think happens is the part of the child that is being traumatized ends up believing and is convinced because why? Feels dirty, feels angry, burning with rage. Well, you ask a child, what is a demon? They'll describe it as such. I believe we're dealing with wounded parts that feel that they're unacceptable, feel that they are demons, feel that something happened and overwhelmed them. And they need to be understood and given a chance to finally be able to talk about what happened. And what you will find is their demon-like characteristics and all of a sudden start to kind of fade away very quickly within moments, and they become just another part. It's like they can finally unzip that persona they've been wearing that was sort of saddled upon them. They can step out of that and realize they have a choice. They don't, and that they didn't want that from the beginning.
Have you ever seen the movie The Babadook?
No.
It's a horror movie from Australia, and it kind of reminded me of that because it seems like the child is possessed, but it's really just the grief of him losing his dad. Mm-hmm. And so how they handle it is that they don't try to exorcise and be, kick the demon out. They nurture like this part of the child that's grief, and so they don't and acknowledge that the grief doesn't go away. So like the Babadook demon is sort of always there, but it's being dealt with at the end, and it's because the child felt like he was possessed because the grief overtook him.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We are 5 minutes past. I know you have a tight schedule. I do like to end these conversations with what you would say to someone to encourage them that now is the time to start speaking out about this issue. So if you have any passing or imparting thoughts.
Yeah, and I know we got off on I directed us in all sorts of different directions. So if we don't do another episode where
you have endless
to
knowledge. So I felt like I followed you, and I'm sure that anyone watching it will take a lot out of it.
With respect to now being the time to act, in terms of what is going on in society, especially deviant men, we are seeing a full-out assault upon women. We saw what happened to Posey Parker. We're seeing what's happening with deviant men that are gaining access to prisons, women's prisons, women and children's private spaces, rape shelters. What you have is deviant, white-collar, psychopathic men have been empowered, and ultimately their deviant sexual desires drives them toward wanting younger and becoming more sadistic, and that's where the eunuch archives and having boys castrated and all that. These deviant men know, and I believe they rode the coattails of the gay rights movement. They were like in the Trojan horse. So you had the women's rights movement first started back in the 70s with Anita Bryant. I'm still old enough to remember that. Gay rights movement came right after that. That was primarily for men. But little did, and we even see it with Gays Against Groomers, nobody ever saw this. I had a hunch, because I knew what path deviants took, that the most deviant were waiting in the back. They were letting everybody else do the heavy lifting, and now they have no use for them. So one of the key figures from Stonewall, they beat the hell out of him recently.
Yeah, Fred Sargent,
Beat the hell out of the women.
Yeah.
Women did all the heavy lifting for all these guys.
Yeah.
Why are these guys now saying kill TERFs? And you think they're kidding.
No, they're not.
Right? It's because deviant guys ultimately will develop an appetite for children. And they know that the last protective barrier for children are protective women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They have to, and porn develops a dark malevolence within the mind of men, within the mind and hearts of men for women. So the further a guy gets into porn, he will develop a desire to humiliate and defile women and ultimately discard them, and then gain access to kids. Now you can see why these perverted men hate women. They want to get them out of the way. And women need to understand, good people differ on the issue of abortion, but women need to understand this, that abortion is not an existential threat. I'm not downplaying the issue, but think about this. You won't die.
No, I agree with you.
Right? But I'm telling you,
it's wild to me.
Okay, but these men intend to silence all women, and in my estimation, relegate them to sex slaves.
Yeah.
And they won't stop. They're starting with women's sports. It's now, they're going to eradicate women from the workplace. This is the existential issue for women.
Yeah.
If women do not take this seriously and stand up, where the million women march on Washington about this? Well, because Planned Parenthood is making money off these deviant guys now. Yeah. Planned Parenthood left women in the dust. It's really pathetic. Yep. Ultimately, when you think about the founders, she was into eugenics.
I actually just learned about this.
So
this last week, because they've hidden it. But yeah, I don't understand why abortion's in women's minds taking precedent over what's happening, because Roe is not worth what's happening to incarcerated women. It's just not like, and yeah. Anyway, I'll go off on a tangent, and I don't want to take all your time. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that abortion rights are worth what's happening on the left side.
Because at the end of the day, if these guys have their way, you're not going to have to worry about abortion, because these guys aren't interested in women.
Yeah. Well, and women, we can help each other control our own bodies, control that. There's an element of control there that you don't have when you're being institutionally preyed on.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
So that's my message to women.
Yeah.
My message is also to good, normal men. They're still out there, I believe.
Yeah.
That it is and to parents, that this movement, headed up by those that are have a financial stake or a sexually deviant stake in all of this, and those that want to decriminalize pedophilia, so the James Canner and others, they are hell-bent in using this. This is the last hurrah for them. I mean, they're at the goal line, and they're not going to stop. Yeah. So the issue of the decriminalization, right? They can't make it legalized. They're lowering age of consent, but the easiest way for them is to then protect pedophiles by decriminalizing it. Okay, so this is all about the normalization, decriminalization of pedophilia, the eradication of women, and then Jennifer Billick's good work. She understands the transhumanism more than I do. Mm-hmm. And the most recent thing about the co-opting of the womb, I think we have to really be concerned about that as well. But yeah. the one population now that is in danger are females. And so that's why I speak out about this.
We really appreciate it
People are being
for the
harmed.
female population saying,
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been, I'm sorry to keep you an extra 15 minutes. I hope I
Oh,
didn't
it was fine. It was
tie
fine.
you up too much, but thank you. And I just really appreciate all the work you do.
Well, Caitlin, thank you. It's been a privilege, and carry on.